Trusteeship Council to stop nuclear testing were disregarded with assurances of our well-being, with two resolutions assuring our well-being in 1954 and 1956, remain the only instance in which a UN organ has ever so explicitly allowed nuclear detonations. And the eventual result was a legacy burden of nuclear risk and exposure which has persisted for generations of human rights, environmental, and health challenges, as addressed by UN Human Rights Council Resolution 57/26 and reported on by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and Special Rapporteurs on Toxic and Internally Displaced Persons. Today, the difficult lessons of our past should help drive international efforts to curb and end nuclear threats through any effective means. Rising global tension has only heightened nuclear risk. The Marshall Islands has recently become a signatory to the Rarotonga South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, and we also look forward to completing timely ratification. It does not escape attention that the Trusteeship Council is due to meet this December. 79 years after the first nuclear test was conducted in my country in 1946, the UN should now be capable of delivering a contemporary acknowledgement and apology for what took place in its name and under its flag, and for not hearing the voice of our people when we told this body to stop. Perhaps after 34 years since our admission as a member of this body in 1991, the appropriate UN organs can help to bring healing and closure over decisions which never should have been made. Madam President, the positive momentum for this year's third UN Oceans meeting in Nice will be needed to demand a reordering of short-term blunder against longer-term benefit. The Marshall Islands stands firmly committed to safeguarding the health of our oceans, which are central to the livelihoods of our people. As a small island and large ocean nation, we are acutely aware of the threats posed by overfishing, unsustainable marine resource exploitation, and the escalating impacts of climate change. Our efforts are grounded in a vision of a healthy, resilient ocean ecosystem which supports both ecological integrity and economic prosperity. As stewards of the Pacific Ocean, we urge the international community to take bold action to scale up efforts in addressing marine pollution, ocean acidification, and supporting small island developing states in strengthening our management capacity. The Marshall Islands joins 37 other nations who have already expressed their support for a moratorium on seabed mining in the high seas until there is a code with adequate safeguards and until we have a close understanding of impacts and biodiversity at stake. More political will is needed to break through a mentality of drill first, ask later, before even assessing what is at stake, including the impacts on fisheries and marine food chains. We have enacted our own national ban on deep seabed mining permits, and as we move to document and manage seamount biodiversity within our EEZ, to our immediate north, high seas mining exploration threatens to expand into exploitation. As important an opportunity as seabed mining may become, it cannot be at the irreversible expense of our Pacific waters and vast fisheries. The Marshall Islands welcomes this week's achievement of entry into force of the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement early next year and looks forward to building a robust early architecture. Madam President, this year is the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement and the creation of the High Ambition Coalition, which helped deliver the agreement's 1.5 degree Celsius warming limit. A decade on, we stand on the verge of that threshold. The International Court of Justice has confirmed that international law demands actions from all nations, whether signatories to the Paris Agreement or not. Its ruling was clear. There are binding obligations to prevent exactly the type of significant harm that we see today, and that will only worsen as temperature rise. The vast majority of countries are failing to meet their obligations. The International Court of Justice has now stated that international law demands action and stringent due diligence from all, that there are binding obligations to prevent exactly the type of significant harm which we face. The ICJ also confirmed what the Pacific has always said. Once established, our maritime zones are fixed, and that our statehood will persist even as sea levels rise. Every country should have submitted its new climate target by February, so that by now we would have a clear picture of what we must do to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. Only 15 countries, including the Marshall Islands, did so by February, and only 32 have done so now. These plans must set out how countries will end the reliance on fossil fuels that holds our future hostage and replace them with the renewables that are better for our health, our economies, and our future. To thrive, we need billions in climate finance, particularly for adaptation and loss and damage. We've heard the promises, but promises don't reclaim land in atolls nations like mine. They don't develop mangrove defenses, shore up our hospitals and schools against rising seas, or preserve cultures deeply tied to land that is slipping under waves. Those things require money. It is past time for the rich world to meet its obligations and get money to where it's needed most. As we approach COP30, we need all nations to deliver on promises to respond to the climate catastrophe. We must close the $1 trillion climate finance gap, particularly for adaptation. We must deliver stronger plans which show how we'll end fossil fuels and have global emissions in this decade. Excellencies, our sharp challenges are far-ranging. Together with Pacific Island neighbors, we face one of the world's highest burdens of non-communicable diseases. Diabetes, heart disease, and other NCDs are now leading causes of premature death, straining our health systems and undermining economic resilience. This crisis reflects both global inequities and local challenges, and it underscores the need for island-driven partnership at scale so that our people can achieve basic human rights to dignity and health care. Madam President, as a small nation, events half a world away are increasingly relevant upon our own shores. Starting with the 2014 occupation of Crimea, Russian aggression in Ukraine has lacked any basis in international law and has pushed the world deeper into global tension. Accountability must be applied to all, and while strong leadership is needed to help fairly resolve and address this difficult crisis, it must also closely and directly involve Ukraine itself. And while the Pacific Islands are halfway across the world, we should have a very direct interest in how small and vulnerable democracies are treated in the footsteps of larger powers. Madam President, a more effective UN Security Council is needed to meet modern challenges. The Marshall Islands considers Japan and India, among others, to meet objective consideration as permanent members of the UN Security Council. Madam President, the island nation of Taiwan has been repeatedly excluded from important international engagements throughout the UN system, despite its role as an important partner to the Marshall Islands and the world in the SDGs, in technical cooperation, and in promoting regional peace. UNCA Resolution 2758 has been repeatedly and falsely portrayed as a consensus on a one China UN law. Never has there been such gaslighting in this institution. While this resolution does address who sits behind a nameplate at the UN, it does not confer or justify any basis for coercion or seizing sovereign control of an independent democratic nation. The UN Secretariat should further end discriminatory practices against Taiwanese passport holders, including journalists, and all member states should understand that these and other politically influenced practices where Resolution 2758 is misrepresented will never be justification under international law for military invasion or coercive acts against Taiwan. Madam President, in 1961, United States President John F. Kennedy addressed this hall and said of the UN that, quote, either it will grow to meet the challenges of our age, or it will be gone with the wind, without influence, without force, and without respect, unquote. It described the UN as two forces. One is composed of those who are trying to build the kind of world described in Articles 1 and 2 of the Charter. The other, seeking a far different world, would undermine this organization in the process. Madam President, the threat of nuclear war that confronted the world in 1961 remains today, though now at an even greater scale. When President Kennedy spoke in 1961, climate change wasn't as widely understood. Today, we are confronted with a range of deep risks, any one of which does not bode well for the future of this world, let alone taken together. The hope for our youngest and future generations is in the profound vision of nations committed to peace and multilateralism. I thank you all. Con moltada.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Mr. Faustin Archange Touadéra, Head of State of the Central African Republic. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President of the General Assembly, Majesties, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, Mr. United Nations Secretary General, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is with a profound sense of responsibility that I take the floor on behalf of the people of the Central African Republic, as our organization marks its 80th anniversary. This anniversary reminds us of a simple truth. our destinies are intertwined. Humanity is one and indivisible. Our peoples can only prosper if peace is secured, if development is shared, and if human dignity is guaranteed for all. 80 years after the founding of the UN, the world is confronted by an unprecedented accumulation of threats, protracted wars, geopolitical rivalries, rising terrorism and organized crime, the climate crisis, humanitarian relief and food security crises that are unprecedented. Not since the Cold War have we witnessed such fragility. In Europe, the war in Ukraine continues to cause immense human suffering and to undermine global stability. In the Middle East, the persistent violence between Israel and Palestine plunges entire generations into grief and undermines the prospects for peaceful coexistence. In Africa, the crises in Sudan, in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in the Sahel, and in the Horn of Africa recall the fragility of the equilibrium that we have struck and the urgency for enhanced support for prevention and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Faced with these tragic situations, the Central African Republic proposes the strengthening of the United Nations mechanisms for preventive diplomacy through the creation of a global conflict prevention fund financed by the major powers and administered transparently. Such a fund should make it possible, at the earliest warning signs of a crisis, to finance good offices missions, international mediation, and the deployment of rapid intervention, credible peacekeeping forces. Likewise, we must systematize the creation of regional coalitions of mediators able to act alongside the United Nations to prevent local disputes from degenerating into open warfare. Madam President, if we wish to grasp the gravity of the moment, let us look particularly at Africa. In 2025, more than 40% of the world's armed conflicts are taking place on the African continent. The Sahel alone accounts for thousands of victims every year and millions of displaced people. One single figure is enough to summarize the urgency here. In certain African regions, 1 child in 2 lives in a conflict-affected area. How can we speak of the future when half of a generation is threatened by war? From the Central African Republic, we know that our own stability affects that of the whole of Central Africa. We also know that peace is never permanent, but always to be forged with patience and solidarity. To mitigate the harmful effects of climate change, we call for an integrated African mechanism for food and climate security, supported by the United Nations, to break the link between resource scarcity and conflict. We call for structural, sustainable financing of peace operations in Africa, based on mandatory contributions rather than voluntary ones. We affirm that peace must be inclusive. It must guarantee the participation of women and young people. Without security, there can be neither prosperity nor the effective enjoyment of human rights. Faced with the conflicts and humanitarian crises that have sorely tested our world, we must collectively recall the normative force of the United Nations Charter, this founding text which, in 1945, embodied the hope of a world free of the scourge of war. Yet today, 80 years later, the question arises: Is the UN still capable of fulfilling that mission? The proliferation of conflicts, the fragmentation of the world into antagonistic blocs, the overuse of the veto and the paralysis of the Security Council give the impression of an organization that is running out of steam. Yet it isn't the UN that is weary, it is the member states, which, through a lack of political will, obstruct its action. Yes, Madam President, the UN can still carry weight in the concert of nations, but on one condition. That is, that we, its members, choose consensus over division, unity over deadlock. I commend and encourage the sustained efforts of the international community to promote peaceful outcomes to the various conflicts. For each day that passes prolongs the agony of the innocent and weakens global peace. In Africa, particularly in Sudan, unresolved conflicts are tearing apart a sister people and risk transforming our continent into a mosaic of fragmented states, unable to ensure stability or meet the needs of their citizens. This prospect is unacceptable. Africa calls for urgent mobilization, not to further militarize our land, but to invest in peace, mediation, and inclusive dialogue. It's for this reason that my country supports the Quad Declaration initiated by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States of America concerning the restoration of peace and security in Sudan. In my own country, the Central African Republic, we've chosen the path of dialogue.
The
policy of reconciliation has led to restored trust and the self-disbandment of almost all the armed groups. This choice was not an easy one. It would have been simpler to give in to the logic of weapons, but we preferred the boldness of forgiveness, patience, dialogue, and the force of consensus. Our experience shows that it is possible to substitute a dynamic of sustainable peace to a cycle of hatred. The Central African Republic, which was once considered as a place of violence, is today is an example that it is possible to bring about a return of peace instead of war. Thanks to restored peace, we are today preparing for general elections in December 2025 that we want to be democratic, inclusive, and transparent, to consolidate the democratic consolidation of the country that was began in 2016. We